I'm your host, Diana Longry. Thank you for tuning in. Off the Record News is a weekly news cablecast program coming to you from SPNN Studios in St. Paul. Now, tonight we are going to be talking about St. Paul big plans. And to help me with the news on these big plans is my co-host, Mr. Copeland, who is a resident of St. Paul and who keeps his eye on what is going on at City Hall. So thank you, Mr. Copeland, for being here.
There's a lot to watch at City Hall. Great to be with you.
Now, we are going to cover two different topics tonight, both of them very timely, both of them a continuing saga that we will be touching on throughout the rest of the year. One being, of course, the increase possibly in the sales tax in St. Paul. We're going to spend about 20 minutes on that topic. The City Council, they were discussing it. They passed a resolution to look into it some more on February 5th, 2020. And then we're going to be spending the rest of our news program talking about the Hillcrest development and the community outreach meeting that occurred last Wednesday. And we went to that meeting, we filmed the meeting, and then right from there, rushed right over here to do our news program last week. So we are a busy news group. So now, Mr. Copeland, I know that you've been watching this sales tax issue, and you were actually the one that alerted me to the fact that St. Paul is talking about increasing their current sales tax. So tell us a little bit about the current sales tax and where they're at right now.
Yeah, this is something that came up after the election. I don't remember any of the candidates running for office promising to enact a 1% increase in the sales tax, which incidentally would cost residents and others who buy products and services in St. Paul $36 million more. Which is not an insignificant amount of money. And frankly, this 1% would be added on to the current half-cent sales tax, which goes to pay for the River Center improvements, bonds, retiring those. And then there's a cultural grants program. And then there's neighborhood projects as well that get about half of the money from that half-cent sales tax. This plan would be used ostensibly to repair our roads in St. Paul, which do need some work. And then there's also a plan to spend money on educating pre-K, 3- and 4-year-old students with much of the money.
Now, let me back up a bit.
Sure.
Okay, roads, I understand.
Right.
That's city business.
Right, and housing is another one.
Okay, but pre-K education, we're talking about the St. Paul City Council and City Hall, right?
Yes.
We're not talking about the school district.
No.
Okay, I just want to be clear on that.
But of course, this matter came up at the school district on I think it was the 5th of February. And Ms. Necker, Councilman Necker from Ward 2 is the major proponent of this increase in the sales tax, and she went down to the school board to tell them what they were going to do with all that money for all these kids, which you would think the school board would be worried about and planning for, as opposed to the city council, which has roads that are falling apart, an empty downtown, a vacancy rate of over 20%, all kinds of issues regarding, maintenance of public facilities all over town. And, it almost sounds like it's this major distraction that's being created because everybody loves the kids. And that's great, but boy, you know what their plan is to have this pre-K program, which under the item in the newspaper, our Pioneer Press reporter said that in 5 years it would cost perhaps $28 million just for the pre-K program. And we just told you that the whole tax only raises $36 million. So that doesn't leave a lot for roads. It doesn't leave a dime for housing. Frankly, as you rightfully point out, if there's going to be some work with the children, we got a big school board there. They got, 7 people down there working hard all the time with the we got more administrators. Gosh, they lost 1,000 children last year. They probably could keep some of their administrators working on this very project. So I don't know, but I think we really have to have our priorities in St. Paul. And you put your finger right on it. Why is the school board being told what we're going to do by the city council with regard to childhood education, pre-K? The school board really has an interest in these matters because what do they want to do? They want to stay in business, and frankly, they've been losing lots of students for lots of years.
And that's within their scope of their duties of what they were elected for as well, is to work within the school district and for the education of our children, which certainly starts pre-kindergarten.
Right.
And as part of that whole public policy of how do you best take the children of your community from little toddlers up through graduation, because your education gap doesn't just start in high school. It starts in the very beginning, and if you don't address it in the very beginning as a full policy throughout your whole school district, that gap just gets bigger. So you see, it is something within that scope of the school district so that you have uniform policies. Because what I see is that you conceivably could have a policy created by the school district and then have a different policy or directive or idea or vision created by City Hall. And then how are they going to meld or mesh the two so that you actually are serving the children?
Well, and frankly, to go just where you're at there, Dana, to give board member Steve Marchese, school board member Marchese, a little credit. He brought up the fact that the legislature has been looking at funding this type of programming. And, before he could finish his thoughts practically, city council member Necker was saying, well, you know what, if the state takes care of the 3 and 4 year olds, we'll start, babysitting, well, that's my word, but we'll start spending the money on the 1 and 2 year olds. Frankly, I think she must have awfully good roads from her home down to City Hall because it's going to take more than what she's bargaining for here to get those roads fixed.
Yes.
All over the city.
Now, we do have some film footage from the February 5th meeting from the St. Paul City Council, and this just scratches the surface because each and every one of the city council members had something to say about this issue, and they were not all in agreement. And see, that's another fascinating thing about this particular topic, is that the council was split on the issue of whether or not sales tax should be increased or for what purposes if it is increased. So let's take a look at our first clip, and I want you to listen to the words you hear. Pretend that you don't know that the topic is about sales tax. Pretend that you're coming to this clip and all you hear are the words, and when you get done hearing the platitudes, the marketing pitch, and the crafting of these very dynamic, artsy, craftsy words, scratch your head and think, do I even know what the concept is that's being communicated at all? What's the topic? Let's take a look.
Item number 32, Resolution 20-2040, committing the city to exploring a new local option sales tax to fund critical investments in the future of St. Paul and the region over the next 25 years.
And Ms. Naker?
Thank you. I am really excited that we're introducing this resolution today, and I want to speak in support of it. I want to give a little bit of context for what we're doing too, because I think there's been some discussion of this in the media, and just kind of want to frame up a little bit about what we're introducing today. So really, this resolution is about seizing an opportunity to make transformative change in St. Paul and catapult us into a position to drive economic growth in the entire region. It's about an opportunity to address some very basic structural needs that we have and also some very basic human ones. On the structural side, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone. We all see it every day that our streets are literally falling apart in front of our eyes. Last year, we had a policy session where we heard that without significant new investment, a third of our streets will be in failed condition, which is worse than they are now, within 20 years. So this is a problem that's not going away, and the longer we wait to fully address it, the worse it gets.
We're going to seize the opportunity. We're going to catapult into growth. You know, it's amazing how these words can be strung together to make it sound like it is something absolutely wonderful. And yet there is no public policy discussion here whatsoever, because certainly roads and streets are a city function. Catapulting into the future, I don't know if that is.
Regional economic transformation. You know,
that's right, transformative. We're going to have transformation, like butterflies.
Well, there's a lot of people that are going to want that transformation, because in St. Paul, whether Ms. Necker knows it or not, and I'm confident she does, is that we have something over 19% poverty rate in this town, and that's an old statistic by a couple 3 years. So when this transformation is being thought about, who's going to pay this sales tax? Well, I'm sure she's thinking about all the visitors to St. Paul that are coming up for the Wild game, or the St. Paul Saints, or Dr. McGuire's soccer team that we spent $22 million at least on, accommodating to buy ourselves a soccer stadium. But those people that are poor in our city are still going to be poor, I feel, and they're going to be paying among the it's neck and neck here. We have a race with Duluth. If this passes, we'll be paying almost 9%, just shy of 9% sales tax in St. Paul. That's what they're paying that in Duluth. And that's fine. I think Duluth, if they want to be the highest sales tax, which they are currently in Minnesota, that's great. They're higher than our neighbors in Minneapolis, which always want to be the leader in taxation. The higher, the better, they say over there. And they're let me get the number here for Minneapolis. They're only at 8.025. So, we'd be at 8.875 with this 1%. The good news is, Diana, that they have to take this over to the legislature before they can do anything. They have to get the legislature to actually approve doing this tax, and then they have to come back and actually give it to the voters to decide on, finally. And frankly...
But that's part of what this resolution is about as well, is the idea that in order to get the legislature to say, yes, A-OK, they have to hire a lobbyist.
Well,
Isn't that correct?
That's what they decided to do, in fact. And then they were very definite to repeat in all the media occasions that they took, we're not going to propose anything this year. We're just going to go over to the legislature and see what they think. Well, folks, there's an election in November. They might have forgot about that since they all got reelected themselves last November. But the legislature, the whole body, Senate, House is up, and there'll be a whole new group of faces over there. So whatever they're doing to persuade whoever, they may really just have to repeat the whole deal. And I'm not sure what they gain by trotting out this crazy idea. I'm just going to tell you, to have the highest sales tax in Minnesota should not be our aspirational goal. There's nothing regionally transformative about that. And everybody who pays sales tax knows it. And, if you want to do something transformative, cut the property taxes in this town.
Well, and also there's if you want to talk about regionally transformative, there are a lot of people who are of the opinion that when one community has a local sales tax and then they increase it, what happens is that people who are accustomed to maybe buying those goods or going to restaurants or whatever in that community, because that sales tax is now increasing again, they may think a second time and say, well, it's really not that far to just drive another mile or two into Maplewood and eat in Maplewood at a restaurant, because there's not the local sales tax yet. or to go to Woodbury, or to go, to some other community that's along the borders of St. Paul and say, let's just go over there and we'll save a couple, $2, $3. And wouldn't I rather give that as a tip to my wait staff than to pay it in sales tax? And you see, that is part of the thought process that does go through people's mind from time to time when they're thinking about where are they going to do their business. And so it may not seem like a big deal if your sales tax is, just a couple of percent, and the local neighboring community doesn't have a local sales tax that's competing with that. But once you start getting up into these higher numbers, it starts to have an impact.
Yeah. Well, what this is really not just Ms. Necker's idea. Now she may have the idea here in St. Paul that on the priorities that they're listing today, the roads, the pre-K program, the housing, maybe money for transit. I've seen that mentioned as well. But honestly, the League of Cities, let's be honest, the League of Cities is putting this out there because they've got 20 applications sitting over at the legislature from the members of the League of Cities, these various towns, that all want their piece of the cake, and we don't have to go too far.
And I think that Maplewood is on probably that list because they've been discussing that at their city council meetings and about hiring a lobbyist to promote the idea that Maplewood should be able to have a local sales tax. And of course, here we have Maplewood Mall that they claim is all struggling and everything, and now they want to put a sales tax, a local sales tax, on top of a struggling retail economy up near the mall. So you see, again, it just sort of self-perpetuates itself. And in Maplewood, we've shown film footage where certain people who are on commissions have said, well, it doesn't really matter if the mall survives or not. We got a plan to put housing up there. Who cares if the mall survives? We're going to just put housing there anyway. What does it matter? Well, that is a bad attitude to have when you've got prime commercial property that its best and highest use by transportation corridors is commercial property, and not to switch it over to, voucher housing.
Well, that's right. And frankly, you're headed right in the right direction with where this train is already going. At the legislature, I think it was either the first or second day at the legislature, the city of Oakdale, accompanied by all the familiar names of your DFL legislative delegation, Chuck Uyghur, Senator Uyghur, and Representative Lilly, and your former city council member in Maplewood, too. He was there, among others. I'm just looking at a picture here. Frankly, they were there to support $27 million in new spending, or shall we say new taxes, or both, in Oakdale for a new police station. I mean, citizens of Oakdale, I don't know, do they feel that they need to spend that kind of money? Then there was another little gem in there, $15 million for a public works facility. Oh, that's right, the police station was only $12 million. We wouldn't want to give you the wrong number. So there you go. $27 million on a half-cent sales tax. And the people in the picture in this otherwise empty chamber were all employees. The police chief, I guess, he's in there, and the legislators. I said to myself, where are the people that are clamoring for this dynamic change,
And I bet you all the people in that picture were all sitting there with big smiles on their face.
They were. They're all smiles, of course.
Well, let's return back to our film footage of the February 5th, 2020 City Council meeting in St. Paul. Again, listening to Councilmember Necker as she's talking about her support for this increase in sales tax in St. Paul.
And on the human side, we have thousands of our residents in St. Paul who are either surviving outside or who have no place to call home and who are finding homes in other cities because they can't afford to live here. Often many of these folks work here but can't afford to live in the city where they work. And on the human side, at this very moment, we have hundreds of our young children in St. Paul who do not have the chance for high-quality early childhood education because of the soaring cost of childcare and the extreme scarcity of childcare spots. And the irony is we know that 90% of brain development occurs before the age of 5, but that is precisely the time when we leave parents to fend for themselves, struggling to find childcare and often paying more than their rent or more than their mortgage if they do find a spot. We know that the best economic investment any city can make is in our human capital, making sure that all people have a place to live and that our very youngest residents have a great start. We know that the status quo is not working. We can't keep raising taxes year over year, asking for state aid, hoping it'll come into our 2003 levels and patching our potholes.
Now, certainly, many of those things are very true statements. But again, we've talked about that public policy, who is actually responsible for creating public policy for our young children in our community, the school board or city hall, when it comes to education and for those types of services. Now, she talked about the fact that housing is expensive in St. Paul and that there are many people who work in St. Paul that can't afford to live in St. Paul. And you know, I was thinking back to some of my experience that I've had with people who have owned homes in St. Paul that unfortunately, for whatever reason, became vacant houses, that they became classified as vacant houses, and that it was one of the most expensive programs and code enforcement program that I've ever seen, because once your house is classified as one of these vacant homes, the cost of doing any kind of renovation is so cost prohibitive that there is no way that you can ever get that house back up to code and livable again. That really your only option is to have it demolished. And now that begs the question, are there other policies that they could look at in St. Paul to address what those policies have as an impact on affordable housing? So if you've got certain other ordinances that contribute to this exorbitant cost of housing, like the vacant house ordinance, well, maybe that would be an easy thing to look at and say, maybe we need to tweak that a little bit and have other kinds of incentives so that people who have those kind of properties or who want to buy those type of properties, that it's not cost prohibitive for them to do so that they can turn those houses around and actually get people living in them at a reasonable price.
And that, is the kind of reform that would really, I believe, would save the city money, would not cost the city money. You've got a ton of people working for the Department of Safety and Inspections, they call it, which runs this vacant housing program with these huge fees that result typically in turning a house into if it's going to be fixed, it's going to require all union cards on the job. It won't be anybody working on their own property because it's essentially not yours anymore to work on when it's out of the 6 month or whatever the period is. I forget the details at the moment, but we lost so many houses in the worst part of the Obama depression here in housing, on the east side and other parts of the city, and we still have dozens of vacant buildings and other houses. Commercial end houses all over town, but mainly on the east side, frankly, and the north end. And
right. So this
no
is
surprise. And
right.
so if they wanted to do something, they could spend some money and some staff time using some creative energy, perhaps, that wouldn't cost us any more money since they're already on the payroll, to come up with some solutions that open up these houses at a cost less than the new houses they're building over there with Habitat for Humanity under former Mayor Coleman, who's now running Habitat for Humanity, that are costing well in excess of, what is it, they're going to build 10, 11 houses for $11 million? I mean, ridiculous, in a swamp. And you can see it because it's on Maryland Avenue. And they got a bunch of people over there. The governor was there and the legislators were there with their hammers. Oh, yeah. So there you go.
Let's hope that they don't get flooded basements if they're on a swamp.
Well, it's a filled-in swamp, but you know how that works.
Well, now
there are no basements. Seriously.
I see. Okay. Well, that's how you solve not having water in your basement.
There you go.
You just build on a slab. There, I understand now. So let's take a look at our next clip.
So this resolution asks us to explore a different idea, which is to explore a new 1 cent sales tax as a way to meet these needs. If each of us pays 2 more pennies for a $2 cup of coffee or 6 more pennies for a $6 sandwich, that will generate $36 million a year in St. Paul every year. And it wouldn't just be us paying those pennies, because the great thing about a sales tax is, unlike property taxes, sales taxes allow the millions of people who visit and work in our city and come in and don't live here to help contribute to the amenities and the infrastructure that they enjoy. It's a really big idea. It's one that we need to explore, and we want to explore in partnership with our community, especially with our business community, with our civic organizations, with our residents. And this resolution does not commit us to a sales tax. It doesn't impose a sales tax. It doesn't introduce a bill for a sales tax, but it does commit us to starting that conversation this year, and I frankly don't think we can wait.
So it doesn't commit them to raising the sales tax or any of that. However, it's really hard to back out of such a idea when you've already figured out how you're going to spend the money that you're raising. And I just love it that she gives that analogy that if you have that cup of coffee and just one more little couple of pennies on that cup of coffee, do you know in the past 25 years, how many times I have heard that analogy or something very similar to it, talking about that cup of coffee.
What the question is on the referendum is, do we want to spend that money? The impact on an average house is minimal. It's probably a cup of coffee a month at its worst.
Coffee's more expensive now.
Yeah, I know. Everybody has, well, what's a cup of coffee cost? I suppose it depends on whether you make it yourself or whether you go with terrible coffee. But probably somewhere in between, between 50 and 80 cents a month is what you're talking about to pay off that referendum.
It's an oldie, but a moldy. Yeah. Okay. So now, of course, as I indicated, not all council members are on board with this sales tax idea, at least not at this time, or at least not for all of these reasons. So let's take a look at one council member and the comments that he made.
I agree that we need to invest in early childhood education, that we need more investment in affordable housing, and that we need more investment in our roads and our transit. I also strongly agree that we need to diversify our revenue sources here in our city to provide the services and infrastructure investments that our community needs. And as we all continue to hear and see and feel personally, being limited to the property tax has gotten uneven and starting to get burdensome, and has already gotten burdensome on some people. I also agree that I think our interest in pursuing a sales tax, an additional sales tax, is something that we should do and we should look to. However, I think that this resolution and the topics involved in this resolution it's not the time to do it right now, and it's not necessarily the correct issues to do it.
Now, he makes a lot of good points after this first minute. But he has to spend a whole first minute to let his city council members know that he's not objecting to their idea, that he doesn't want his supporters to think that he's turned his back on them. So basically, he's got to say, yes, I agree with the sales tax. Yes, I agree with all these good initiatives, and then gets done with all the flowers and the fluff and the hugs and all of that. But then says, but this is not the right time and maybe not quite the right issues. So let's continue and see where he goes.
I think both from a legal standpoint and from a realistic perspective of actually passing these at the Capitol, we should think about this more and have more of this conversation amongst ourselves before we try and put something out, even a test balloon at the legislature. The sales tax conversation, the statute was amended last year, as I'm sure people around this table know. So that's about as recent as you can possibly get. I think it's important to note the guidance that the legislature gave us with their amended statute and what that can go to.
So in other words, Mr. Copeland, it sounds to me like the state legislature has modified the statute that pertains to local municipalities asking to have a local sales tax, and that they actually prescribe what purpose those monies can go to. Is that correct?
That's correct. They did that in response to the initiative by the mayor of Duluth, actually, who put, with her city council, put an initiative on the ballot to spend some money fixing up their roads, which after some major storms were in worse condition than they were before the storm, when they weren't in very good condition either. And they are unlimited funds as well. And so that measure actually passed. It passed, the people supported it pretty overwhelmingly, actually, as I recall. It was over 50%, without any hardship. They didn't spend a lot of money promoting it. People knew they needed to do something. And that's a capital improvement, fixing your roads, obviously. So then the legislature got thinking, well, are we going to have all these cities having all these referendums coming up with more taxes? And that sales tax has traditionally been, although there's been big exceptions here of late in the metro, a state revenue source. So then they decided, well, we're gonna tighten this thing up, and that's, as Mr. Tolbert, Councilmember Tolbert, points out, there are some statutory criteria, and typically the legislature is looking at capital improvements of a local nature. And some of that is a little bit self-serving on the part of the legislators, because often legislators in the past would get requests for capital improvements that they wanted to, that their local officials would want them to get into the state bonding bill. So this kind of serves a couple of interests of legislators to have this arrangement. And I think certainly Councilman Tolbert, although he didn't say it, and I far from me to put words in his mouth, but or the legislature, but I don't think the pre-K idea would fly in the context of the new approach to sales taxes. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, when I sit and watch these clips, if Ms. Necker filed for the wrong office. Maybe because they had a majority of seats up over there at the school board. I don't know. She could have easily run for school board if she wanted to do all this school business. And they would have loved to have her over there, because they love coming up with referendums and more taxes. Even though they keep losing students, they seem to need more money all the time to build more buildings.
Now, he brought up a good point in that he was saying, well, maybe we need to have an increase in our sales tax, but before we move forward going to the legislature, maybe we should step it back a little bit and talk more about the public policy amongst ourselves, so that they could flesh it out a little bit more about what the plan really is, and whether or not if it is the right timing for instance. So let's take a look at his continuing comment.
Most specifically, I think just a few lines that would be important, and this is 297A.99 local sales taxes, subdivision 1A requirements. Local sales taxes are to be used instead of traditional local revenues only for construction and rehabilitation of capital projects when a clear regional benefit beyond the taxing jurisdiction can be demonstrated. It goes on to talk about if voter approval happens, and I think an important line in subdivision 3B, the proceeds of the tax must be dedicated exclusively to the payment of the construction and rehabilitation costs and associated bonding costs related to the specific capital improvement projects that were approved by the voters under paragraph A. And I just put that out there because some of the issues here that we want to explore on a basic reading don't necessarily qualify for that.
So in other words, what might qualify, like say if you're talking about housing, or you're talking about the pre-K, is the renovation of a vacant building, for instance, to renovate it to make it repurposed for housing, for pre-K, for whatever. Now that would be a capital expenditure, and that would certainly fall within the categories that he's indicated the statute requires. So there you
Well,
go. But that's not going to pay the salaries
I
for
hope
the
they don't,
people to care for
I hope they don't
the
call
children.
you up, Diana, to be their consultant. As much fun as you might have over at the Capitol. But, that's very clever. You see, when you use that human capital, you know, you can come up with things. But no, I think you got it right on. I think Tolbert and the statute, and I certainly are in complete agreement that you got to come up with something.
It's not going to pay for salaries. That's what it's not
Exactly.
going to do, because that isn't the same kind of category.
Bingo.
Now, switching gears.
But you had a clever thought there, I got to tell you.
Now, switching gears, we got to go on over to our next news topic, and that is the Hillcrest development. And for those of you who have been watching the program over the last few weeks, you know that we have been following the Hillcrest development by going to the various meetings that they've been holding. We started with their meeting, the Community Advisory Committee meeting back in December. And so we've been showing film footage of that. Now we've got film footage from the community outreach meeting that was held February 19th, 2020 at the Hayden Heights Elementary School. Now, at this meeting, there was probably about 150 people from the community who came to hear what was going on. Regular residents of both Maplewood and St. Paul, that they came there to find out what's going on because they had ideas about what they wanted to say too. Well, anyway, our camera was there, and so our first clip is to show you some of the ways that have been developed to help engage the public. Because after all, isn't that what they want to do? Engage the public to get their ideas? Well, let's take a look. So, as you can see, it is the typical posters on an easel routine. And everybody was given little stickers to put on their little poster as to what kind of housing would you like to see in the Hillcrest development. Now, when you looked at that poster, what was the variety that you saw? High density, high density, high density, high density, high density. Our reporter asked, where is the picture with the single family housing in it? There was one picture with single family housing in it. He put his dot on that square. You know what happened as a result of everybody seeing that there was a dot on the single family housing spot? The high predominance was everybody else put their spot on the single family housing. Well, there you go, community input. Now remember, this is the site where the Port Authority is claiming they're going to have 1,000 housing units and 1,000 jobs.
On a 112-acre site.
So you get the idea that there's a little disconnect between what the residents of St. Paul and Maplewood have in their mind versus what the Port Authority has in their collective minds. Now, we also laughed a few shows ago about the fact that there was a discussion about the use of pipe cleaners as a way to engage the community in planning how to do things and how to make things happen in a development and a master plan. You give them a bunch of pipe cleaners and then they fashion trees and little animals and whatever. Well, they didn't use the pipe cleaners, but you saw that they did have the little electrified trees on the poster board. Very clever. Certainly beautiful.
Yeah, I noticed those, but before I noticed those, Diana, you had the clip with the posters, and at the top of the poster it said, Hillcrest Master Plan. Now, that's very interesting because this is the first community meeting of the size and nature that creates the planning process normally. Mm-hmm. And we all know that this property is already owned by the city and was bought with no process at all except with what the Port Authority did to actually buy the piece of ground from the pipe fitters. And then they walked over and gave the bill to the council, and we all got the bill, or we will, in our taxes for 2020 and for the next 25 years, something like that. So, this is kind of disturbing, frankly, because when you see all of those, because I wasn't at the meeting because I was here Wednesday last week when they had this, and so to see all those high-rise buildings, and people have to appreciate those of us who are looking at this, know this, who live on the east side, but for people that don't, we are talking about an area that has nothing but single-family homes around it. There is the Iowa high-rise, but that's not exactly a neighbor. It's in the broader neighborhood, but that's the tallest building in the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And frankly, to be thinking that they're going to sell us on this concept with promises of 1,000 jobs and 1,000 homes on 112, and that's before you put in, all the roads and you put in any other kind of drainage areas and whatnot.
Right, all the infrastructure, and also it was talked about at this meeting that somebody brought up the fact that originally the promise was that there, out of this 100 or so acres, that 20 acres of it was going to be set aside for green space. And now that number is shrunk down to like 15 acres. And now we come to hear at that meeting that actually 14 of those acres are the wetlands. So you see, they can't build on those anyway, and so sure, it's going to be green space, it's going to be wetlands. But I don't think that's the same concept that people were thinking about when they're thinking about green space.
Well, in the resolution that was adopted by the council when they bought this property, they're talking about the Port Authority will deliver 5 acres of active improved park area at a location to be determined by the master plan, which I guess they didn't show us the park yet. But then there's 15 acres, as you mentioned, for accessible passive, open green space. And you could imagine what that is.
Yes.
Now it's a beautiful piece of property in the sense that it's rolling, it's got lots of trees, and the idea that you're going to remove those trees and scrape that earth down to some level housing development. I don't think that's going to set well with the neighbors, and
right.
they're all living in single-family homes surrounded by that beautiful land with that nice green fence. It actually has that green rubberized fence.
And there's a value to keeping the rolling lands.
Absolutely.
Because you can still have the housing and you can still have the development with the rolling lands. Of course, it might make it a little more difficult for actually, building everything. You just got to be a little more creative, but that's part of what gives it its character. Now, you had brought up earlier that you noticed that those poster boards specifically said master plan. So the question then is, well, what was the purpose of this meeting if they're already got conceived ideas about what that master plan is going to be from the Port Authority side, of course. So let's take a look at our next clip as the purpose unfolds.
Good evening, folks. Good evening, folks. Can you hear me? Yep. In the back, Monty, how we doing? Yeah, we're pretty good. Okay. Welcome. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's better, right? For coming into this very cozy Minnesota cafeteria and for an evening to talk about the Hillcrest Golf Course. My name is Bill Dervity. I'm the planner for the City of St. Paul, and I'm the project manager for the master plan for the golf course. We want to provide some information tonight. We have a few basic things we want to do. It's very exciting to be talking about the future of the golf course. Of course, it's been closed for a couple of years now. What's going to happen in the future, I'm sure some of you are anxious about it, some of you are excited. We're glad that you're here no matter what. We value your time tonight and want to make this a useful event. We're going to, this evening, the purpose is to introduce the project so that everybody knows what's going on, to give you a baseline of information so that you are informed, to let you know how you can stay involved going forward. And let me tell you right now, the best way is to sign up for emails, either out here or on our website, stpaul.gov/Hillcrest, because if you got a mailing, it's not certain we'll do a mailing again. We may just advertise by email in the future.
Okay, so the purpose then is to, one, collect information, like your email address, because they may not be sending out notices, mailed notices in the future. And you see, the point of that is that then it limits the amount of exposure of notice to the general public at large. Only the people who are on the email address are the ones who get informed. And as we found out at the meeting that was held this week on Tuesday, that there are going to be pop-ups that they do not want the general public to know are occurring, that they only want the people who are specifically targeted on certain email lists to even be aware that those pop-ups are even occurring, because they don't want the public to taint the results. He also indicated that the purpose was to introduce what's going on with the program. Well, that means when you say introduce what's going on, that means that something is already going on. And so we know from the past, when we've had these news programs, we have read specifically from the memorandum from the Technical Advisory Committee that they already have a path in place. And you see, this is all just part of the pretend trappings that they're engaging the public, because the memorandum from the Technical Advisory Committee already says what the path is that they are proceeding down. And then he also indicated that the best way, that they also want to use this meeting to tell people how they can stay informed and engaged. Okay, but not once did he say the purpose of this meeting is to pull you into the process and have you help us create the public policy and the design of the development. He never once said that. That promise was never made.
Yeah, I think the big clue was on those two poster boards that said master plan, and what they probably could have said was the master's plan, because it seems to me, I see that the mayor showed up, and that's great. We don't see enough of the mayor on the east side. But you know, if you're just bringing something over to have rubber stamped in effect, that's not the way things should be done. That certainly was not the process that the city followed on the Ford site. That's not the process that took a decade, essentially, to develop that property. And frankly, we're talking about a piece of property that is just as big and just as important to the east side as the Ford plant property was to Hillcrest, or to Highland, rather.
Yeah, exactly. Now, in our next clip, they're going to continue to talk about what they're hoping to garner from the attendees. Are they looking to get ideas from them on how to develop this development, or just something different? Let's take a look.
We also want to listen to both your hopes and concerns about the site. This is a kickoff event. We're just getting started, and it's very important for us to get a baseline about what people really care about in terms of hopes and concerns. So thank you for that. I will be available for questions all night. We will have a number of stations where we will be moving around after the initial presentation and the short question and answer session, but I will be available for any questions about the project in general. And also, could Catherine Sarnicki raise your hand? Catherine will also be available. Catherine will be speaking to us in a bit. She is the project manager for the Port Authority. The St. Paul Port Authority owns the property. The City of St. Paul is leading a master plan process. So we are separate but related entities and working together side by side on this.
So we heard him say that they were there that night to gather and hear the residents' hopes and concerns about the development. Now, that, call me a cynic, because most people hearing that would say, well, they're looking for input from the residents so that they can make a better plan, so that they can do a better development that's based upon what the neighborhood would like to have. Well, yes, I mean, that's theoretically the way it should work, but we have seen in our coverage of the Rush Line BRT that generally what has been happening when they collect the hopes and concerns of the residents is that they then take those hopes and concerns and then they use that actually in their marketing pitches in order to either promote the project, to highlight the positives, the hopes, or to use the negatives as a way to overcome objections. And so that by gathering hopes and concerns, it's more for the marketing of what their plans are rather than how to develop the plans. And most people don't see it that way, but if you've been covering these types of processes long enough, you can see that there is a distinction in what they are actually doing with the data.
Yeah, that the difference is always between a public meeting where you have an open process and a public telling where people are basically selling you on what they've predetermined in their meetings that they've had in private to decide what they're going to do. And it may be that they've already gotten some funding approved for the way in which they want to lay out a particular project, which is somewhat what has happened here, I believe. And we just haven't been clued in.
One of the Metropolitan Council meetings that I watched not too long ago, there was a great presentation, which I'm hoping to bring some of that film footage to these news programs, because again, it is very eye-opening, is that generally speaking, for many of these projects that are incorporating any kind of federal funding, that one of the pieces of being able to get that federal funding is that you have to be able to demonstrate that you have had these community outreach meetings, that you have been out there gathering information from the residents about the project. It doesn't say, though, what you do with that information. It just says that you have to demonstrate that you have gone through the dog and pony show. Not necessarily what you did with the information you gathered at the dog and pony show. And so this is very interesting. That's why it is so eye-opening to watch these different meetings from different levels of government, because then you start to really see the connections between how this public policy at one level is really generated or is created as a result of a policy at a different level.
Well, and one of the problems that the city and the Met Council, when they're in St. Paul, has, and other entities like DOT or what have you, in St. Paul, we have a commitment that runs back to the 1970s that was a federally required part of urban renewals, what the programs were called in the days of Johnson and whatnot, that led into much of the changes in our city. But requiring citizen input, as you point out, goes way back, and frankly, it is not something that should be treated as a dog and pony show. The whole system of our councils in the neighborhoods, our district councils, is based on this federal requirement That was one of the reasons that Mayor Latimer and others put this institution together of our great, it really makes St. Paul a great city, in my opinion. I got involved in my district council right off. I remember my first meeting at the city council was when, well, I won't mention his name, but a former organizer who became the mayor of St. Paul decided he wanted to get rid of the city council system, the neighborhood council system, and wanted to get rid of the staffing and whatnot as a budget consideration. And I went down there and I testified. I said, "What are you doing? This is a distinction that St. Paul should embrace." and ultimately that argument won, by the way. But this is the problem why people don't have confidence in their government, is because the government starts deciding things in advance of asking which are the residents of the city.
Right. Now, you did mention that you noticed that the mayor of St. Paul, Melvin Carter, was there. Well, he actually said a few words, and we won't have time in this news program to play all of the comments. But to wet your whistle, we're going to start. So let's take a look at our next clip with the mayor.
Of St. Paul, Mayor Melvin Carter.
Thank you all for being out here. The quickest thing I have to say is our community is in good hands. It bodes well that this many people came out to participate in this planning process, and I look forward to us creating a plan together. One of the things that I hope you've seen if you live in St. Paul, or maybe even if you've been looking in from Maplewood, is that we're very focused on engaging people in the process of governance, on the process of building our city for the future in the way that we deserve.
Those comments certainly apply to the process that was applied to the Ford plant site. Certainly those comments are applicable to the fact that St. Paul is a charter city and that the residents of St. Paul have rights given to them by the charter to be more engaged and have more opportunity to be engaged in their government, and certainly the fact that there are district councils in St. Paul. So all of that is correct with that scope and that umbrella. But then the question then becomes, at what point does it actually apply to this project? Because did he say for this project Hillcrest development? But he said St. Paul in general. St. Paul is known for this. Well, yes, because they're a charter city, because they have district councils, because of other certain factors that other cities like Maplewood, being a Plan B city, can't attest to because they're not structured the same way. So that's why it's important to understand the backstory in many of these comments that are made by these elected officials to understand if they're being truly authentic about the statements they make.
Well, one thing that would surely give the citizens confidence that they would have a role in this project throughout its future and in the future of these politicians is if they would spend the little bit of money it would take to send a notice in the post, in the postal service. A bulk mailing is not that expensive. I think there's a lot of politicians that send a lot of cards to voters. So, it works for that. Why not keep up with those mailed cards?
Well, we will continue this report next week. And also tune in to our other news programs, Local News Report and the Citizens Reporter, because we also have those newscasts where we can continue the discussion and the report, not only on Hillcrest, but many other timely issues that are important to you. So thank you again, Mr. Copeland, for being here.
Great to be here.
And viewers, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.